Do you know what you're having for dinner tonight? This roasted squash with goat cheese galette is exactly what you want this season. It has Parmesan, it has a delicious crust, it has roasted onions and squash inside of it. It's absolutely delicious. It goes together quicker than you think. Let's make it. When we're going to make something like a galette, it starts with a pie crust. Now this galette is gonna hold obviously the season's best squash. You know I love it. But what we wanna start with is what I think is a pretty simple pie dough. Now pie dough can scare people, and the reason we usually say a galette is easier, it's the same process, the same recipe for the dough, but instead of forming it into a pie crust and actually having to have a nice rim on it and everything, you don't have to do any of that. You just make a big circle, you fold it up on itself, it's rustic, it's wonderful. So it is a little bit simpler and it does take a little bit less time, but the dough should not scare you because it really is easy. We're gonna start with flour, all-purpose flour. And you know what? You don't have to worry about the different flours when it comes to something like this type of pastry. All-purpose flour works really well, and that's what I always use. I'm also gonna add a little bit of sugar. Now this I will do in any pie crust. It's not so it has sweetness, it's so it actually browns correctly and just has a good seasoning to it. A little bit of salt too. A little bit of salt, and I say a little bit because this one's gonna be slightly different than my normal pie crust for fruit pies or whatever. I'm adding in some grated Parmesan cheese. I grated it really finely, and you can see how fine that is, and it will just melt in to the crust itself. And it has a flavor, it will brown beautifully, and that's what I love. So I'm gonna put that right in there too. So once all the cheese is in there and the dry ingredients, I always just mix them at first just to make sure everything's well combined, because now what we're gonna do is add our butter. Now I had the butter cubed, and I'm someone that, just to pre-plan, I pop this in the freezer for a few minutes too. I like well chilled butter. When you're going to make a pastry or a pie crust, you want it cold. All the ingredients cold. There are some people that will freeze the flour and everything. Life is too short for all this, but I do like to do the butter, make sure it's cold. So now what I do is first just take it in there and I fluff it in, just to make sure each butter piece is maybe coated in some of the flour. Now, you're gonna notice I'm doing this by hand. I'm not using a food processor. You could use a food processor. Sometimes I'm like, why get something dirty? And I like the irregularity I get when I do it by hand, and you get better, flakier crust, I think. So after I've done this, I just pick up piece by piece and start picking up some of the flour, dry mixture, and the butter, and look, just pushing it between my thumb and forefinger, letting it fall off. We're gonna start doing that evenly to all these pieces. They're gonna be irregular, and you'll see it's kind of a shaggy mixture then. So towards the end, what you'll notice is I start getting a mixture that looks a little bit closer to a cornmeal, but with big still pieces of butter. You see some bigger flat pieces. See how those are bigger? And then at the end here, I kind of just start going like this a little bit and go a little bit quicker, and it just breaks down the butter. And what I'm trying to get to is not really an even cohesive state, but watch. When I pick up some of this dry mixture, I make a fist, it holds together, but right away, it just crumbles apart. That tells me I'm ready to now add ice water. Now, obviously a recipe always says an amount, but it gives a range because guess what? The time of year, the temperature of inside, outside, all that changes how much water a pie crust takes. So yeah, it will take maybe a time or two of making it, any pie crust, to go by touch and feel, but then you'll get it. I know, that sounds a little bit ethereal, but it's true. So what I'm doing is slowly just mixing in that water I added. And what we want is a cohesive dough, but not dripping, obviously. So what I start checking is how it holds together, and it still crumbles apart when I make a fist, and so I know it needs some more. Then at that point, I start adding maybe just 1 tablespoon to 2 teaspoons or something at a time, so it isn't as much, because you don't want to go too far. You can always add more water, it's hard to take it out. And then as I'm mixing now, I'm starting to notice the crumbles are getting bigger, and I'm starting to notice if I do this, look, we have a dough, and it doesn't crumble apart the same way. That's perfect. So now what I'm gonna do is take my plastic wrap, I like to have it ready, and this is just a good way to form the dough without it getting all over the counter or your fingers, and just make it a little bit more cohesive. So I just put out all these little pieces that I have of the dough right onto it, and take the size of the plastic and use those. See, work smarter, not harder. And in this case, we are just pushing the dough onto itself, and you can see it has a cohesiveness to it. It has more of an actual dough consistency. And you don't necessarily want to overwork it, but I'm pushing it into a disc rough. It's a rough disc. That's okay. This is a galette. It's a rustic, rough galette, and that's okay. So we're pushing it, and what I do now is once it's at that somewhat cohesive state, I'm just going to tightly wrap it, all these sides up, and then I'm going to flip it over, and I just pat it and push it into a nice dough and a nice disc. And now you can see this is ready to go into the fridge. So while the pie crust is chilling, we can actually just get our filling ready, which is using the seasoned, my favorite squash. I love squash. And we're gonna use a couple different types just for looks because I love them. I love delicata. I love leaving the skins on delicata because it's beautiful. And once it roasts, it's very palatable. It's not a tough skin, it's actually pretty thin. And delicata by itself would be really annoying to have to with all the ridges of peel. And then we have some butternut. And the butternut, I did actually go ahead and peeled some, just because sometimes butternut, depending, it can be tough. I personally like eating it, but a lot of people don't. And so when you take them in half, you just want to take the seeds out. And of course with the seeds, you can use those separately. You can roast them. You can put some spices on them with some oil, roast them in the oven. They are a great snack. And that's one of actually my favorite snacks in the fall, because you can go sweet, you can go savory, you can use them on salads, you can sprinkle them kind of on anything. So you can save those, or for the pithy part of it, you can actually just put that in your compost pile. So here I'm gonna start putting on some of my squash. And then for my butternut, I'm gonna not do the long shreds. You can see here, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit thinner pieces. So I'm gonna leave them somewhat the same, but I want it to be irregular sizes. And it gets down here, it gets a little bit bigger where the delicata was a lot more narrow. So down here at the bottom, I do like to take those and just give them a nice little chop so they're a little bit more easy to eat. I'm gonna put those right on here. So on top of that, I'm gonna put onion. And all this is gonna just roast in the oven together. And you can see what I did with the onion was, I cut off the root end and the stem end, and then I just go through and I slice it. So when it roasts, you're gonna get nice, not caramelized by any means, but you're gonna get roasted bits and browned bits, and all that's gonna what? Give flavor, and that's what we want. So to this, we're also gonna add a little bit of some herbs. So some fresh thyme. There's nothing to me like the fresh thyme, and get some of those leaves on there. You can actually just even roast if you want to the whole stem, and then pull out any of the big stems when it's done. So I'm just pulling those right out of there. There is nothing like fresh thyme, and then some fresh sage. And when I do it, I do roll it up just to kind of give it, not really a chiffonade, but a little bit. And the thing is, you don't need a lot of sage, but my goodness, that flavor. So think of this all with maybe your Thanksgiving meal, whatever it's gonna be. That's gonna be good. So we're gonna just drench this now a little bit in some oil, and we're gonna make sure it coats everything. So I'm gonna take my hand, I'm gonna make sure, and I'm gonna just toss it. Once you have it all tossed, just roughly put it out into an even pile. It won't be perfect, but that's okay. And then what we're gonna do is do the best thing here, salt. Whenever you're roasting a vegetable, this works for any vegetable I'm doing, make sure you salt it well. That's what's gonna make sure to add flavor. It's gonna really season them, and that's important here. You need the seasoning. And let me get my hands just a little bit cleaner because they have the oil on them, and it's just hard to do my pepper grinder with that oil. So we're gonna take pepper, and we're gonna make sure we get it over at 2. Now we can just pop these in a good high heat of an oven to really get them roasting, and we'll be ready to put it together. I pulled the disc of dough out of the fridge, and the reason we put it in the fridge is to chill the butter again. It hydrates. It's just what you need to do for a few minutes. And what I love when you see here through the plastic wrap is all the nice big shards of butter in there. So we're gonna have it just a well-floured surface. And now we're gonna roll it out. So I like to roll it out ahead. Obviously, everything's roasting that we're gonna put inside of it, but it's nice to have this done. So we're gonna just make sure we put it on well-floured. I think I just brushed myself in flour, but that's okay. If you don't get dirty when you're cooking, are you even having fun? And we're gonna slowly, I like to constantly be moving my dough as I'm rolling it out. So I just always am turning it. You know, I think I heard this years ago where I watched my mom do it, and it just is ensuring that it's never sticking to your counter. And that's what you want, a dough that doesn't stick. If it gets too warm, you can always pop it back in the fridge. If it's gonna get warm, that's when it really does start to stick because it really soaks in that flour then. So we're gonna constantly be turning and rolling. And as you're turning it, it actually keeps a better shape too, if you keep it moving, because you're constantly moving that shape outward and keeping that round disc somewhat. And once you get it out to your overall size you want, you just can put it back onto a parchment lined sheet. Now we're gonna go and bake it directly on this, but I like to have it on there and then just chill it well. So I usually fold my dough in half because it doesn't stick with the flour. Get it over to my sheet with the parchment, and you can just open it back up. It's a beautiful dough to work with. And I'm gonna throw this back in the fridge just to chill while we're waiting for everything to roast, then cool slightly. I'm excited. I pulled these out of the oven. You can see they get browned and roasted and caramelized, and they just look delicious, and I wanna eat them right off there. So what we have here is a good chilled crust, and I'm gonna take some goat cheese, and I had it at room temperature so I could spread it. Goat cheese, to me, what I love about it is it has an earthiness to it, and it just works well with things like squash. It just does. And if you don't like goat cheese, you could do another cheese that's spreadable, but let's all take a moment and think about goat cheese. My mom used to think she didn't like goat cheese, but when she has in applications like this, where you have more flavors with them, especially with, we're gonna up it with a little bit of herb, I think it's totally worth rethinking. And look how beautifully it spreads. Unlike cream cheese, it has a lot more of a richness to it. Goat cheese with that almost tangy earthiness kind of offsets the richness of a cheese. And that's why I think it works really well here. It's well balanced, if that makes any sense. And so I'm just spreading it out and not going all the way to the edges, you can see, because we're gonna fold this over. It's a galette. Remember, it's a rustic shell that's gonna be folded upon itself with all of its fillings. And now what we're gonna do is sprinkle on two things. I have a little bit of sage over here, and that I just chopped up again. Again, sage can go a little bit a long way, so we don't go too much, but just enough to remind us that, oh yeah, there's sage in here. And then a little bit of this thyme leaves, which we're just gonna sprinkle right on top. Once all those herbs are on, we're just gonna take our mixture here. So we let it cool off just slightly because I don't wanna put a hot mixture onto my chilled dough because it would just melt it at first and melt the butter. And see how those onions really cooked down, how the squash really cooked down. That's what you want. Okay, now we're gonna fold up just really roughly. It's nothing special here. And you can see when I fold, I just somewhat make a crease every so often. Put your finger in, just make a crease, pull up. It's nothing special. It is nothing that you have to be worried about doing just right. That is the point of a galette. Ah, that looks good. We had a good dough. We have some good squash there. At the end, what I do, I will drizzle on some oil onto the crust more, and I'll brush that on because that will give us a little bit of a finish. So usually when you do a galette, say, with fruit, you're gonna do a cream or an egg wash, which you could do the egg wash here. I just like to do some oil. And then I like to take my Parmesan and put some right into the center, but then also, don't be scared about letting it go on that crust because it's gonna get browned, darkened, and have this beautiful crustiness to it that I just love. When you can darken that Parmesan, it's delicious. So now, we're gonna put this back into the hot oven, let it bake. Here's the galette. I've let it cool for a little bit just because it's too hot to get, right away and cook. What's great about these is when it's a filling that's already pre-cooked, you don't have to worry about fruit being thickened or anything. It's already done. So as long as your crust gets fully done and browned, you're pretty good to go. And now that it's been sitting for a little bit, it's easier to transfer. And this is just gonna make it so it's easier for me to cut. I don't like to butcher up my pans. So guys, this is always the exciting part. Where are we gonna cut? We're gonna get the best piece. Someone needs to try it. And it's gonna be me. It's gonna be me trying it, and I'm pretty excited about it. So what I'm noticing is, and do you notice this? The flakiness of that crust. And if we look at the bottom, look at that goldenness. That's all that butter that got really, and look how flaky it is, and you get some Parmesan in there. I'm not gonna say I'm excited. You would think after eating this a few times, I'd not be excited, but I'm excited. So you want a well done crust, and look as I cut into it. Do you see the goat cheeses underneath? What that does is act almost as a good base. So it's not just one note, you get the earthiness too. Those are good. I feel like I should just invite you all over and be like, let's make galette. You need nothing else. This is like a meal. I mean, it can be a side dish. Think of this with like a squash soup. A lot of squash, but who cares? It's great. What I think you will not understand until you make it is that tanginess of the goat cheese is essential and almost brings out more of the sweetness from the actual squash. The onions become sweet because they were roasted. You get a little hints of that Parmesan in the crust, which has a nice seasoning to it with that Parmesan-y funkiness that you just want. This is delicious. I have nothing more to say about it other than I think you should make it because I think you're gonna enjoy it. So that's exactly what I hope you do with this video and this recipe. Make it, share it, enjoy it. When you share these videos, it helps me immensely, but it helps everyone else see food is not hard to make at home. It can take a couple steps, but anybody can do this. Try and try again. If a crust takes you more than once, that's okay. It took me a few years sometimes to have the perfect crust. But once you get it, everyone's gonna love you for it. Make it, share it, check my website, wiseguy.com for this recipe, all my other recipes. Until next time, enjoy something beautiful and eat it. That's the whole point.